This is a story about speed, but not the kind that blurs past a trench line or thunders across a hedgerow. It is industrial speed, the tempo of fixtures and gauges and cranes, the rhythm of shifts cycling at midnight, the quiet authority of a tacked board that tells a line when the next hull has to move. When people say they built tanks fast, they are usually pointing at a number, but a number by itself cannot carry the weight of what happened. Speed in this context is a tightly choreographed sequence. How long it takes to bend armor plate and stress, relieve a weld, how quickly a bogey set is torqued and tested, how smoothly a turret ring drops into place, how reliably the engine and transmission meet and behave as a single organism, how predictably a completed hull rolls out to the test track and then onto a flat car already assigned to a routing code. It is not a stunt. It is a system. The scope here is deliberately narrow and, in that narrowness, truthful. The focus is roughly 1942 through 1945, when the United States learned to translate the culture of automobile mass production into armored fighting vehicles at a scale and speed that startled not just allies and enemies, but even some of the industrialists orchestrating it. American automotive DNA, interchangeable parts, process layouts that privilege flow, and an almost obsessive dependence on jigs did not magically become tanks overnight. It had to be hammered into place. Armor plate does not behave like fenders. A turret is not a door. The journey from auto line to tank line was a violent education in steel and tolerances, and the speed we will measure is the tempo that emerged once that education took. Speed is also a matter of throughput, not just the moment a tank is declared complete. If a line claims 10 vehicles a day, but rail yards cannot clear the flat cars or ports cannot slot the convoy, that speed is theatre. The kind of speed that made observers gasp was compound, a plant cadence that could be graphed, a rail schedule that did not choke, a port that could absorb, and a field depot with enough trained hands and crates of spares so that a fresh battalion did not die of paperwork. The center of the story, then, is the alignment of those elements, with the tank plant as a lens. The reason German prisoners of war feature here is not because they were unique savants of industrial life, but because their surprise was so quotable. A man captured at the end of a long supply line who had watched the sky at night for the glow of his own country's factories burning had a particular angle on the word impossible. When trainloads of nearly identical green hulls appeared behind the lines, when knocked-out vehicles were replaced while the unit was still learning the ground, when crates of standard parts appeared like a second language that everyone could speak, disbelief hardened into a kind of respect. It is easy to project myths onto that disbelief stories want to compress, to round up and dramatize and sharpen the contrast. But underneath those myths are documents that do not care about stories. There are plant logs with rates and line stoppages noted in neat columns. There are ordnance acceptance records with signatures and inspection stamps. There are timetables, shipping manifests, reports from test tracks, paperwork from depots, and wear patterns recorded in the grease of road wheels. Those are the receipts. The tone, throughout, must be calm, because the documents are calm. There is drama here. Wars and factories always produce it, but the style of this narrative is more like an engineer writing down what happened and then checking the figures. The flow begins by naming things correctly. A tank line is not a single line. It is a braided river of sub-assemblies that only calls itself a line because someone with a clipboard decreed the meeting points and moved the clocks to match. The speed of that line is an emergent property of decisions, taken months earlier about tooling, supplier capacity, and the precise order in which human hands meet steel. When those decisions were right, the line looked almost easy. When they were wrong, production did not slow, it stuttered. The difference matters. It is also important to make a promise at the outset about balance. There is no need to pretend that speed is costless. Some trade-offs lived in the design choices themselves. Some defects escaped during surge months. Some batches went to sea with the wrong spares because a catalogue number was misread. None of that unravels the central claim. It grounds it. The impression that captured soldiers reported that the Americans could simply outpace events was a composite image made of thousands of sober, unromantic acts, fixtures aligned, gauges zeroed, punch lists cleared, shift whistles that people could set their lives by. The extraordinary was built from the boring, and the boring was worshipped like a ritual. What follows keeps three words at the front of the mind: define, date, and demonstrate. We define terms in plain language, so nothing mysterious props up the argument. We lay down a short timeline early so the viewer always knows where they are. And we demonstrate with receipts, a recurring, compact panel of facts about plants, line rates, work hours per hull, and the logistics chain that moves a finished tank from the yard to a unit that needs it. This approach resists the gravity of rumor. It also invites the audience closer. If someone wants to argue a point, the argument has to move through the same documents. That's a useful gate. So this is the story. An American system learned to push steel through an ordered sequence with a tempo that felt unreal to observers who had grown up in a different industrial language. It is not a hymn to more. It is an account of alignment, raw material, process design, labor cadence, acceptance standards, and transport clicking into a groove. And in that groove, time behaved differently. A vehicle that would once have been the work of a handful of craftspeople became the result of 1,000 skilled acts, none of them heroic on its own, all of them indispensable, and together fast in a way that made even enemies put down their skepticism and measure with their eyes wide open. Before numbers grow dense and factories crowd the frame, it helps to set a few reliable dates on the table, to be carried like waypoints. The first is the threshold where planning became steel. In the last months of 1940 and into early 1941, as the United States watched the world convulse, tool orders were being placed, blueprints hardened, and the logic of automobile mass production began to be bent toward armored vehicles. Workshops that had known stampings for car bodies started learning the temperament of armor plate. The phrase pilot model was said more often, and the first production jigs, the sacred furniture of any fast line, were cut and recut until they yielded the same result twice. By the close of 1941, purpose-built capacity stood up on American soil that had never seen a bomber overhead. The dedicated tank plant outside Detroit, conceived in the idiom of flow that automobiles had taught, pushed its pilot runs into something that felt like a heartbeat. Early vehicles were not yet the canonical shapes that would come to dominate photographs of the war. These were the learning tanks, the ones through which a workforce and a management culture taught themselves what it meant to marry heavy fabrication to a schedule. This, more than any single page of output figures, is what fixes the first waypoint. There was a moment when a peacetime industry crossed into wartime cadence, and people on the factory floor could feel it in their legs on the walk home. The next anchor arrives with the solidifying of 1942 into a year of proving. It is when suppliers who had promised castings began delivering them with boring regularity, and when the insane problem of getting engines, transmissions, and final drives to agree with one another was solved not with rhetoric but with standardization that would have looked insulting if it were not so obviously correct. A vehicle that was once kept in the station for 10 hours now rolled forward in 8 because the parts it met there were already pre-fitted to an agreed geometry. This is not poetry, it is a timestamp. The line moved because all the upstream fixtures whispered the same measurements to each other. In 1943, the story develops the texture of momentum. Standardization stopped being a managerial aspiration and became the culture. Sparks flew from the same seams the same way every day. The paint line dried at a predictable rate. Test track inspectors developed the trained boredom of people who have seen every failure mode and can smell the new ones. And the rail yard, that crucial invisible organ of speed, learned to clear flat cars like a practiced reflex. The effect of all this on faraway soldiers was simple and bewildering. Losses that had once felt like sentences came to feel like commas. When a unit looked back over its shoulder, there were vehicles coming, not in singles, not as gifts from fortune, but in batches, each one close enough to its neighbor that spare parts stowed in the belly of one could heal the other. The timetable here is not an abstraction, it is the distance between two trains. By 1944, the cadence had turned into a kind of muscle memory for the system. The country had become, in practical terms, a rhythm, where another belligerent might have devoted managerial energy to persuading workers to stay through the night after the sirens died. The American industrial problem was of a different sort: how to keep the flow fed without piling inventory in the wrong places. The line rate, expressed as tanks per day, is an attractive number to cite, but the real tempo hides in smaller cycles. How many hours from engine delivery to mating on the line? How many minutes to set a turret and confirm backlash? How long a completed hull waits for a flat car after it climbs off the test track? These micro-timers were tuned all year, and the evidence that they worked is found not just in plant records but in the quiet efficiency of the rail sidings, where idle time leaves a film like dust and was scrubbed away. As 1945 drew the arc downward, the timeline acquires its last waypoint: conversion and taper. The system that had been tuned for a single song did not simply stop, it shifted key. Output reduced, some lines retooled, and acceptance standards held their ground as if to remind everyone that speed was never a trick. The infantryman or tanker receiving a vehicle at the last would not have recognized this macro movement. To him, the flow still looked like reliability. But in offices and union halls and drafting rooms, calendars sprouted new deadlines and the daily tempo wound itself down. This matters because it reveals the mechanical nature of the earlier surge. What could be tuned up could be tuned down, which means it had been a system all along, not a frenzy. The advantage of keeping this handful of dates and beats late 1000, 940 into early 1000, 941 for tooling and pilot runs, the proving year of 1942, the momentum of 1943, the muscle memory of 1944, and the tapering conversions of 1945, is that every claim made later can hang from them like tags. When we discuss a bottleneck being broken, we can ask whether it is a 1942 fix or a 1943 maturation. When we meet a report of trains groaning under identical shapes that seem to propagate by division, we can weigh whether the scene belongs to the peak or the long preparation that made the peak possible. A timeline that you can hold in your head is not just a convenience for viewers, it is a discipline for the storyteller. It prevents the seduction of the outlier, the anecdote that flatters itself as typical because it sounds good in a paragraph. For the men who wound up as prisoners and reported their disbelief, these dates were invisible but their effects were not. They faced the results downstream. Formations that filled out again before rumour could keep up. Spare engines that seemed to exist in batches instead of as rare charms, and an enemy who could build a vehicle with the kind of impersonal confidence that is hard to argue with. The witness of a prisoner is a human clock set by shock. Our clock is duller but fairer. It ticks in plant hours, rail days, and the calendar of a system that tells time with the same unromantic posture every day until a war says it can stop. Every complex story needs a simple place to rest. In a tale about factories and trains, and the way steel learns to obey a drawing, that place is a small, stubborn set of facts that you can return to without rereading an entire archive. Think of it as a pocket card, not a spectacle. The names of a few key plants matter because they anchor the action in real buildings. The dedicated tank works outside Detroit that turned an idea into a discipline. The companies that had been born making freight cars and learned to cradle armored hulls. The locomotive-wise fabricators who treated a turret casting like a pier to a boiler, and the car body specialists who handled welded assemblies with a confidence that came from millions of stamped panels. These are not just logos on a wartime poster. They are distinct dialects of metalwork, folded into a language that could be spoken at speed. Now fix a handful of rates in mind, not the breathless kind, but the ones that would appear on a wallboard in grease pencil. The first is the nominal line rate measured in vehicles per day, the deceptively simple headline that most people reach for. The second is more honest and more useful. The average hours of direct work inside the plant per hull, watched like a hawk by foreman because it is sensitive to everything: tool wear, supplier, consistency, rework, and the little tragedies of alignment that a jig can cause if its soul goes crooked. The third is the shift cadence, the pattern of human time across 24 hours. It matters whether the line is fed by 8-hour shifts that overlap, by 2 12s in a crisis, or by a 3-shift march that turns the day into a wheel. The choice of cadence is a philosophy about fatigue and mistakes as much as a plan for output. Put with those rates a short catalogue of standardized sub-assemblies that determined whether speed could be trusted. Suspension bogies that were identical enough to be swapped in a depot mudyard without consulting an oracle. Powertrains matched to final drives, not with luck but with tolerances that deserved the name. Turret rings and traverse gear that would not develop a surly personality in the field because their backlash had been measured and recorded with the quiet cruelty of a good inspector. The existence of such sub-assemblies does not make the story glamorous. It makes it real. When people who are skeptical of fast production imagine a rush, they picture corners cut. These standardized kits are the opposite. Corners squared, so that later hands do not bleed fixing them. All of those things swim inside a larger number that rarely gets cited because it is not romantic, railcar turn time. A finished hull is not a weapon if it sleeps on a siding. The interval between a tank clearing the test track and a flat car clearing the yard defines whether the plant's tempo escapes the fence. The American advantage here was not a secret formula, but a country-sized organism built to move things. Railroads that could be reasoned with. Yards that could be bullied into order by dispatchers who saw the war not as news but as a schedule. The decision to prioritize the clearing of certain loads was as much a part of speed as anything the welders did at their stations. The flat car is the handshake between factory speed and battlefield need. If it is late, the handshake never happens, and all the talk about output becomes theatre. With these facts in the pocket, the script can keep its promises. When later you hear a dramatic claim this many tanks in a month, that many units replenished before a campaign, you can ask the small, boring questions that protect the truth. What was the line rate in that period? Did the average hours per hull drop because of a genuine improvement, or because inspection standards were relaxed during a surge? Did the shift pattern change to solve a bottleneck? And if so, what did the rework numbers look like a week later? Were the sub-assemblies the same across plants, or did a hidden diversity creep in because of a casting supplier that could not meet demand? How quickly did the rail yard clear the finished loads, and did the port have convoy slots to match? This is not cynicism. It is the kind of curiosity that keeps admiration honest. From the perspective of a captured soldier trying to make sense of the trains, none of these measures had names. He saw silhouettes and multiplied them in his mind. He watched fresh vehicles arrive as if hatched, and the detail he clung to was the sameness wheels in the same place, turrets that traversed with the same sound, hatches that slammed with the same note. Sameness is a form of mercy in war. It means the manual learned yesterday applies today. It means the crate of parts that found its way to a muddy yard will likely heal whatever is broken. When you are measuring with fear and rumour, sameness looks like magic. When you measure with a clipboard, it looks like the consequence of fixtures and gauge blocks and inspectors who will not be charmed. The durability of this fast fact spine is not just a convenience for the viewer, it is a discipline for the storyteller. It prevents the episode from leaning on grand adjectives when small nouns will do. It allows the narrative to breathe because you can rely on a few stones in the stream to cross back and forth. It also gives shape to the myth and reality section that will come later. Debunking is easier, fairer, and more persuasive when you can set the rumour against a rate or the breathless claim against a railcar turn time that cannot be faked. The card in your pocket is not a replacement for archives. It is the door key that lets you visit them without getting lost. Everything else in this story will climb up and down that small ladder of facts. We will examine bottlenecks and watch them shrink. We will follow a hull from fixture to paint booth to test track and recognize how much of its fate was decided before the first spark flew. We will listen to people captured on the wrong side of the front, try to argue with what their eyes told them, and fail in interesting ways. And throughout, when the words begin to swell, we will return to the card. Name the plants, name the rates, name the kits, name the railcar. If the claim cannot survive those names, it is not a claim worth carrying. On paper, surprise is sterile. It is a line annotated with exclamation points. In the field, surprise has a face. A man crouching behind a ditch line toward the end of a long campaign looks back and sees trains. He cannot count them properly. No one can at that distance. He guesses. He hears the talk that runs through units starved of sleep, that the Americans are making these things faster than the ground can swallow them, that every loss is a pause instead of a wound. When he is captured and asked what he thinks, he laughs first, because disbelief is easier to carry as a joke. Later he reaches for his factory metaphors. He knows craft. He knows the smell of a shop that respects a single piece for hours. He knows the pride that comes with a fit that is more art than measurement. He cannot square that with the impression of speed that looks like a trick. What he misreads honestly, understandably, is flow. He sees the end state, the long sequence of sameness that suggests a conjurer's sleeve. He cannot see upstream. He does not see a network of suppliers repeating a dance so tightly that a subassembly arriving late triggers a short, local panic and not a philosophical crisis. He does not see fixtures that coerce steel to behave the same way every time, whether the welder slept or not. He does not see a drawing that has been taught to hundreds of hands until it has lost its romance and become a reflex. For him, repetition is what a worker does, not what a nation does to matter. So when he meets repetition at national scale, dimensions taught to factories like grammar, he calls it impossible. It is a fair word from his vantage. His disbelief gains strength from a second misreading. Speed equals shoddy. He has been warned all his professional life that haste is an insult to quality. The thing you labor over becomes a vessel for your skill. The thing that glides past your station before you can attach your pride to it must be lesser. But the object in his imagination is born in a single pair of hands. The object that crosses his line of sight is born in 1,000, each one expressing its pride in obedience to a measurement. The acceptance inspector's stamp is not an afterthought here. It is a piece of authorship. When he walks around a knocked-out American tank and finds that everything fits, everything else hinges that behave like they have cousins 1,000 miles away, bolts that do not sulk when asked to meet their nuts, he does not have a drawer in his mind for that kind of consistency. It feels like someone got away with something. Later, when he is behind wire and the weeks slow down, his stories grow precise in the way memories do when they are told often. He tells interrogators that the flow of replacements made tactics feel provisional. He tells them about crates of spares arriving with a confidence that mocked improvisation. He tells them about the mood that sets in when an enemy's depots seem to be a place where things go to be made right instead of a graveyard for broken promises. He does not have the jargon for tact time or subassemblies or railcar turn times, so he reaches again for dramatized numbers. He multiplies the trains in his mind. He shrinks the hours. He is not lying. He is translating industrial awe into the language he has. The interviewers on the other side of the table, for their part, try to sort the heat from the light. They triangulate his claims with receipts, plant logs that do not brag, rail schedules that do not blush, port lists that do not pound the table. They find a pattern that makes his astonishment make sense. It is not that the Americans were magicians. It is that they were relentless bureaucrats of metal. Where the prisoner imagines a ditch between speed and quality, they show him the bridge. Standardization that transfers the dignity of craft into the dignity of compliance, and compliance that can be scaled without shaming the result. He leaves the room not converted into a true believer, but disarmed, because he has been asked to argue with a timetable. The shock also came from an asymmetry that has nothing to do with ethics and everything to do with geography. The prisoner's home was bombed. The factories he imagines as the measure of seriousness were forced into a rhythm of interruptions, alarms, firewatch, flickers of power that make any talk of line rate a dark joke. The country that captured him made tanks in buildings that never heard an air raid siren and could treat the calendar like an ally. When he calculates the speed of an enemy's production, he secretly includes his own losses as a moral counterweight. It makes the arithmetic feel less cruel. But the ledger does not accept that entry. The wind over a Midwestern test track did not carry smoke. A schedule kept is hard to defeat with feeling. There were, of course, real mistakes and real limits. He sometimes saw them too. He saw vehicles restricted by design choices that would later be revisited. He saw batches that ran too hot in the field and demanded patient repair. He heard stories of shipments delayed by the prosaic humiliations that haunt great enterprises, a congested yard, a storm that makes a port moody, an accounting error that sends the wrong kit to the right unit. None of it released his disbelief. If anything, it sharpened it. He concluded that if speed could survive these indignities, it was sturdier than he had expected. The line kept its pace not because it was untroubled, but because it had been built to absorb friction without drama. If you want to understand the face of shock as recorders wrote it down, imagine the prisoner being walked past a siding stacked with nearly identical silhouettes. He cannot know the hours inside each one, but he knows the taste of inevitability. He stares as if the factory is still attached by an invisible pipe that pours out product whether the war is in a good mood or not. He does not have the right metaphors. He will reach for words like endless and unbelievable. The truth is smaller and stranger. Someone made a calendar and then made machines obey it. The prisoner's disbelief is, in the end, a compliment to the dull bravery of that act. It says that he recognizes in his enemy not luck, not magic, but a confidence born of keeping promises to steel, to time, and to trains. Begin where the steel begins. A slab that looks indifferent is coaxed toward purpose by heat and pressure until its grain is trained to hold a shape. The mill's rolling calendar determines when armor plate is in a mood to be bent without cracking, and from that moment the clock is not just ticking, it is orchestrating. Plates arrive with certificates that might bore a poet but thrill a foreman. Composition, hardness, thickness within tolerance, batch number you can trace like a lineage. The first station is not dramatic. It is chalk lines and a template, a jig built once by someone with a ruthless respect for symmetry. The plate is clamped, edges cleaned, holes pilot drilled where fixtures will bite later so the plate remembers how to be held. Nothing has the right to be freehand. The factory writes the first sentence in a grammar of control. Cutting is where sparks make the story look like work. Torches follow a path that has been walked 1,000 times, guided by patterns that have no patience for improvisation. Panels shaped to meet again later are given small, almost affectionate bevels, so the weld has a valley to live in. The geometry is deliberate. The welder's puddle is a citizen in a city planned months ago. By the time the plates reach the fitting station, men and women who might never meet on a street know each other's work by feel. A corner that thinks for itself will meet a corner that does not tolerate independence. They are drawn together by fixtures that look like furniture from a country where only straight talk is spoken. The clamps bite down and do not let go until the seams are welded in layers and cooled according to rituals that were argued over last year and now simply are. All of this takes place under a sky of gauges: pressure, temperature, travel speed, current draw, the little nervous movements that prove a process is alive. Welders do not perform feats. They perform the plan. They check for penetration and porosity, then send the joint to be ground and peened, not for beauty but for predictability. After the hull's box takes a deep breath and holds it, measuring tapes and squares come out like a courtroom. Dimensional inspection is a sermon everyone attends whether or not they have faith. If the jig is right, the hull forgives small sins. If the jig lies, no prayer will fix the curse that the next 5 stations will inherit. Speed here is not haste, it is relief. The feeling when measurements agree with the drawing and time stops bleeding out of the day. Machining is the moment the brute meets the precise. Bored holes for trunnions are cut by the machines that have personalities and are treated like temperamental relatives. Tooling is changed with a choreography the supervisor cares about more than birthdays. Coolant flows. The notes on the clipboard show a tolerance band that believes in itself. A cutter that screams is not a hero, it is a problem, and problems are not allowed to steal minutes. Meanwhile, in another building, gears are being cut and heat treated to a hardness that makes their teeth sing the same song, and engines that spent the night under test stands are settling into the idle that will be their signature. Sub-assemblies move on carts with labels that would make a librarian proud. This is not a factory so much as a river delta. The hull is a place where many modest streams finally meet. Paint is not a masquerade. It is armor's second skin. Blast cabinets erase scale until steel shows the complexion the painters trust. Primer finds every slight wound the day has given. Drying is timed like bread in an oven, and humidity has an opinion that everyone respects. The color that makes a nation out of parts is applied in coats whose thickness is measured as if it were gold. The paint line is a clock within the clock, and its rhythm has caused more arguments than any speech about patriotism. When the crane lifts the hull and sets it on its running gear, that moment only looks like an award ceremony. What it really is a handshake between the day shift and the night shift, between the station where weight meets spring and the station where weight meets power. Engine and transmission mating are a wedding performed by people who think more about talk than love. The alignment routine is scripted. Mount points are cleaned until they squeak. The hoist operator is a conductor, and the millwrights are first-chair musicians. Bolts are torqued in sequences that feel like spells to outsiders, but are simply physics being obeyed without drama. A wrongly torqued fastener can act like a liar in court later, so the procedure does not permit pride. Cooling lines and electrical harnesses are not added. They are invited, because their routing has been thought through on a long winter night by someone who hated surprises. A good harness is a map. A bad one is a rumor that burns down a day. Turret integration is where the hull decides whether it will keep its promises under fire. The bearing is greased like a sacrament. The ring is checked again, then once more, because backlash that looks harmless in the shop turns into a curse in the field. Traverse motors are introduced gently and tested with a solemnity you might mistake for prayer. The sighting equipment is aligned with a care that insults drama. Micrometers, shims, breath held, a human eye that has been trained not to boast. Inside, cables are tied down in ways that keep them from learning to chafe. Outside, the turret drops into place, and suddenly the box looks like a face. People in the aisle glance up as it turns. That is not pride. That is recognition. The test track is truth with dust on it. Engines that purr in the bay clear their throats under load and reveal their intentions. Suspensions mutter what they plan to do when the terrain is not a gentleman. Brakes confess their flaws where confession is cheap, not on a hillside far away. Inspectors note leaks and gremlins and send the hull back across the street when necessary, and the line absorbs the insult because it was designed to. Better an hour here than a day in a depot under rain. Acceptance papers carry signatures that believe themselves liable to the future. When they are satisfied, the vehicle earns its next conversation, the one with the railroad. Loading is where the factory shakes hands with the world. A flat car waits like a stage. Chains know they're not. Chalk marks show where weight should sit to keep a train honest around a bend. The routing code is assigned and written down in a language that dispatchers read with a kind of love. A set of spares travels with the hull not because someone was kind, but because someone was organized, and the kit list was argued into existence until it could survive an audit. The last act inside the fence is paperwork, but it never feels last. People stand around and look at the thing they have made and do not clap. They watch the car roll away, and somebody scratches a note that will join a machine's biography in a file cabinet older than anyone on the floor. Every minute you have just walked through exists not to impress a visitor but to keep a promise to time. The station-to-station cadence, the glide forward when the bell rings and the crane moves, is where speed lives. When outsiders call it unbelievable, They mean they cannot believe that human beings can cooperate at this scale, without someone breaking the spell. But cooperation was settled months ago when jigs were squared, when suppliers pledged to ship like a heartbeat, when supervisors learned the virtue of boring consistency. A tank hour is built from unglamorous obedience, from the humility of tools kept sharp and the refusal to let a process improvise. And if that sounds small, remember what the hour adds up to when it reaches the siding. A vehicle that will behave the same way in the hands of a stranger, this week, next month, and in the mud where schedules go to be tested. No line runs at its headline rate until it makes a map of what resists it. The map changes over a year, but certain obstacles return like seasons. The first is always material. Armor plate arrives with its own calendar, and mills have their tragedies. A rolling stand goes sour. A furnace behaves like a poet instead of an instrument. The plant cannot scold steel into punctuality, so it duplicates its bets. Second sources are not Plan B, they are the other half of Plan A. Contracts are layered so that when one mill coughs, another can clear its throat. The bottleneck moves from the gate to the layout when shipments finally learn to show up, like tides. That is when the second, more intimate bottleneck appears. Fixtures that are good enough when you are learning but too slow when you are confident. Fixtures are the furniture of speed, but like all furniture they can trap a room in the old arrangement. A jig that made a supervisor proud last spring suddenly looks like a grandfather clock that eats minutes just by being there. The engineers crawl over it with tape measures and curses. They lighten it. They move a clamp that bruised a panel and force 2 minutes of coaxing every time. They change the order in which a seam is closed because the old order taught heat to pull the plate into a sulk. These are not aesthetic decisions. They are the difference between a day that hits its tact time and a day that misses by one hull and makes the night shift pay. The broken bottleneck leaves behind a ghost, a story told at lunch about how the shop lost a month to a jig that everyone was too polite to hate sooner. Turret castings have personalities that border on troublesome. The foundry knows how to pour, but cold shuts and inclusions will appear like rumours unless the mould is courted like a queen. The answer is not scolding, it is feedback with receipts. Rejections at the tank plant are measured, charted, and returned to the foundry like a report card that has to be signed. The tempers cool and a change to risers or gates cleans up what used to turn into rework. The bottleneck shows up as an empty bay where turrets should stand, and it disappears when the charts trend into boredom. Every time a casting arrives ready, the line inhales a little relief that looks, to the outsider, like speed. Powertrains bring their own kind of drama. Engines and transmissions are marriages arranged by torque curves and gear ratios, and the ceremony has rules. If an engine line is 1,000 yards away, and its output arrives late or arrives in batches that do not speak the same dialect, the tank line leaks time out of every corner. Here the fix is choreography. Schedules are written like treaties. Buffers are introduced not as warehouses for laziness, but as cushions for humanity. Dispatchers get their own heroes, a foreman who knows how to turn a truck in 10 minutes when the dock looks like a chessboard mid-game, a clerk who can make 2 stamping plants argue less by refusing to accept their excuses unless they are incomplete sentences. The bottleneck leaves fingerprints in the mating station, and it is erased by the unglamorous science of making other people's clocks agree. Gear cutting is where fine teeth bite into the line's patience. A dull hob is a thief. It steals minutes with every pass and then has the nerve to leave burrs as a receipt. Tooling inventories are built like a war plan. Sharpening schedules are posted and enforced. The machines that make the shapes which make other machines move are loved, and in that love there is an insistence on ritual. Statistical process control sounds like a meeting, but in practice it is a religion of dots on a chart that refuses to let noise disguise a trend. An operator who marks the outlier and calls for a pause is not the enemy of speed, he is its bodyguard. The bottleneck that hides in scrap is shamed into visibility and then pushed off the stage by attention paid before failure blooms. Transport looks like an externality until it is not. A flat car shortage can turn a triumph into a farce. The yardmaster is as much a member of the production team as the welder, though the two may never share a cigarette. Agreements about priority become printed orders. Car turn times are measured like heartbeats. When a storm closes a port and the yard clogs, patience will not save the day. Rerouting will. The nation's arteries are learned like anatomy and used with the calm of a surgeon. This is where a hidden bottleneck shows its teeth. Inventory piled in the wrong place pretending to be wealth. The cure is to treat everything that does not move as guilt. The line wants to be a verb. Cargo that cannot leave makes it a noun. In all these cases, the great temptation is to reach for slogans. Work harder. Work longer. Be patriotic. The line laughs softly at this because it knows the truth is smaller and more technical. Change the order of operations because heat warps confidence. Put the inspection at the station where a mistake still has time to be caught without poisoning the day. Duplicate a vendor even if the procurement office rolls its eyes today, because next quarter one of them will have a furnace leak. Make the measurements visible, not to shame, but to convert hunches into things people can act on without starting an argument. The broken bottleneck is a relief you can draw a circle around. That is why it feels like speed when you fix it. It is not magic, it is subtraction. The culture that breaks bottlenecks learns to suspect heroes. A station that is saved by a legend at midnight is a station that will fail again in a week. The manager who refuses to be charmed by a rescue is not cold. He is wise. He wants the problem killed in its crib, not slain in the square for a crowd. That wisdom accumulates. People begin to redesign their work so that quality is inevitable and speed is the side effect. The notion that haste breeds error dies in the corner because the line has demonstrated the opposite. Boredom breeds error. A job that demands attention at a human scale, repeated at a national scale, becomes a rhythm. And rhythm, once it is real, dissolves the resistance that used to dress itself up as inevitability. When visitors came and tried to find the miracle, they walked past it. It was the clamp moved 2 inches to remove a dance step from a welder's day. It was the delivery dock repainted with lines that taught trucks to behave. It was the procurement officer who learned to love 2 suppliers haggling over his business because he feared winter more than he feared paperwork. It was the inspector who took pride not in catching defects but in watching the count fall until his job looked like a sinecure. Bottlenecks are a factory's personality flaws. Breaking them is character growth, and in that growth, the schedule transforms from a bully into a metronome that everyone can live with. Rumor is the war's second language. It spreads faster than requisitions, louder than a train, and it gives soft minds something hard to hold. When men talked about the pace at which American armor showed up, their stories broke into 2 postures: admiration that sounded like fear, and disdain that sounded like comfort. Both make sense because both are human, but if the goal is to understand rather than to perform, rumor has to be coached into facts. That coaching begins by asking what the myth protects. Often it protects pride. Sometimes it protects hope. Either way, it does not protect the truth. The favorite myth was elegant in its cruelty. Speed meant shoddy. Nothing complicated hides inside it. Just a lesson every apprentice learns from a master. Take your time. Respect the material. Do not let a clock shame your hands. It is not wrong in a shop where a single piece is loved into existence by a few people who will sign their names inside it. In a plant with a line, the lesson takes a new shape. Respect for the material becomes respect for the process that many hands built together months before this piece arrived. Shoddy is possible, of course. All human work contains the impulse to fail. But the line's defense against shoddy is not the individual craftsman's pride. It is the measured predictability of a joint that is welded the same way every time because the fixture refuses to allow a different way. The reality does not sing. It mutters. Specifications obeyed. Inspections signed. Tests run on a track where boredom is the prize. Another myth declared that the famous line rates were late inventions, a flash at the end of the war when momentum had become a tourist trap for numbers. It is true that rates peaked after the line had learned itself. It is also true that inflection points exist earlier, in the months when standardization stopped being a memo and became a reflex. The charts, never beautiful but always convincing, show the slope changing where you would expect after a winter of rework, after a summer of supplier training, after an autumn when transport finally learned to clear the yard. The temptation to compress the story into one big jump is understandable. The reality is kinder to boredom, step changes that feel like a person growing up. One day the shoes fit without thought. There was no miracle, just 10,000 mornings of getting dressed. A softer myth said that prisoners exaggerated because men who lose must explain their loss to themselves. There is dignity to that suggestion, and it deserves respect. But not every breath drawn behind wire is a defense mechanism. Many of those astonished testimonies line up with schedules and logs and delivery tallies that never learn to lie. Overstatement is a risk when memory becomes literature in the mouth, yet the skeleton underneath stays honest. You can see it in the way their stories repeat the same images, trains, sameness, a kind of inevitability that makes tactics feel like an argument with weather. The exaggeration, where it exists, is a rounding error on truth. If you draw your measurements from paper born in offices far from rumor, you end up near the same place. The line's pace escaped the fence line and became a presence in the field. A more technical myth, whispered in shops where precision wore a necktie, was that interchangeable parts were a marketing scheme. No two castings are ever truly identical. No two holes bored by different machines ever perfectly cohere. The line listened and smiled, and then showed what interchangeability means at scale. Not absolutes, but bounded sameness. A set of dimensions that never insults its neighbors. A kit of spares that can heal cousins. A turret that marries a ring without sulking. The religion of the gauge block does not require miracles, only honesty. Interchangeability is less a boast than a pact. We will stay within a band wide enough for the field to function and narrow enough for the inspector to be proud. If a rumor wants perfection, the factory offers reliability instead. Sometimes the myth was flattering to the line. It said that a secret machine, a mysterious automation buried in a building without windows, had replaced human fallibility. People love this one because it lets them keep their romance with magic while honoring the result. The truth, though, is unsentimental. The special machine exists, yes, but it is special because it was designed to be dull. It holds a piece the same way every time. It does not have moods. It will do the wrong thing forever, if not taught the right thing once. Its gift is in removing decisions from the worker that should have been settled in the drawing. The glory stays with the people who argued over the fixture last year until it taught the machine how to behave. Myth asks for a dragon. Reality offers a clamp. Debunking does not have to be cruel. It can be tender with the needs that myths serve. A soldier who survived an ambush wants to believe that the enemy's vehicles are fragile because comfort tastes better than statistics. A foreman in a battered shop wants to believe that anyone who boasts of speed must be lying because the world feels more just when talent and time are synonyms. You can hold those feelings with respect and still show the receipts that make them less necessary. The quiet power of reality is that it does not need to raise its voice. It points to an inspection stamp and a departure schedule, and a depot intake list and a maintenance log that shows a field repair done in an hour because a kit contained the parts the engineer expected to fail. It is enough, so the myths settle. Not because they are shouted down, but because in a room filled with documents, they run out of chairs. What remains is a story with fewer adjectives and more nouns. Hull, jig, hours, rate, yard, convoy, depot. When the words become this plain, the exaggerations look embarrassed. They leave the stage without being escorted. And what is left is not drab. It is luminous in a quiet way, like a watch face in the dark. It tells time. It lets someone far from the plant, standing in a field that smells like mud and hot metal, know that the train he has been promised is not a rumor. It is a schedule with a name. A machine can be drawn on paper by one mind. A line cannot. It requires institutions, which is just another word for agreements that outlive a single shift. When you watch a tank plant keep its promises day after day, you are not seeing a building with talent. You are watching a country decide to become a process. That decision reveals itself in modest ways that are easy to miss. A procurement office that refuses to worship the lowest bid if it buys uncertainty. A standards body that writes a specification in sentences so clear that a worker with grease on his hands can obey it without reading it twice. A ministry that understands the difference between urgent and panicked. None of this is romantic, and all of it explains why speed looked uncanny to people raised inside different arrangements. At the center stands a simple structure. Someone is allowed to decide what the same means, and everyone else has agreed to be governed by that decision. The person does not have a cape. She has a desk, a stack of drawings, and a sense of humor about how words can ruin steel. Standardization is not a spell. It is a document that creates a community. Once the community exists, the miracle is not that parts fit. The miracle is that people who do not know each other, separated by 1,000 miles and by 1,000 small insults from the world, act like a single mind. The turret ring that leaves one city in winter meets a hull in spring without any ceremony, and the meeting feels inevitable. That feeling is the scent of an institution doing its job. Across the water, there were other institutions with different habits. Some prized craft so deeply that standardization felt like an insult to honor. Some were fractured by rivalries that made interchangeability sound like surrender. Some were shaken hourly by bombs and chose improvisation as a way of staying human. It is not contemptuous to say that their arrangements could not manufacture the same kind of speed. They produced brilliance in other places, design decisions that made engineers sigh with admiration, field modifications that were poems written with wrenches. But when the conversation is tempo, how many hulls a day, how many trains a week, how many kits a depot can count on the advantage, belongs to a bureaucracy that treats sameness as a public good. What does this bureaucracy look like when you stand inside it? It looks like meetings. It looks like charts. It looks like someone insisting that an inspection report be returned with the right boxes filled. It looks like fatigue being taken seriously because tired hands harm schedules. It looks like union stewards arguing safety and hours with a stubbornness that, in a quiet inversion of cliché, protects productivity rather than insults it. It looks like a city council that decides not to fight the plant over a road closure because freight needs a path at 2 a.m. It looks like a rail dispatcher who has the authority to push aside a peacetime priority in favor of wartime necessity and does so without making a speech. It is not exciting unless you understand that this is how excitement is avoided. The institution shows its strength not only in quiet times but in crisis. When a vendor fails, the reaction is not scandal, it is substitution. Another supplier is brought forward without panic because the paperwork that connects them to the line was written before anyone panicked. When a design change is necessary because a field report has proven a weakness, the change is cut into the drawing with a sobriety that knows the cost of creativity 2 steps downstream. Rev levels are tracked so that no one falls in love with an outdated idea. Training material is rewritten and read by people whose reading hours are paid because learning here is not a hobby. Even the depot inherits this discipline. The kit that arrives under canvas has parts organized in a way that makes a mechanic feel respected. The freight network itself becomes an institution the factory can rely on, not just the track and the engines, but the rules about who gets to say which trains move first. Those rules are written behind doors by people who understand that a delay in a northern yard becomes a headache for a southern port 3 days later, which becomes a unit's sorrow a month hence. They write the rules with this causality in mind, and then they enforce them with a steadiness that looks like dullness. Dullness is the personality of reliability. The trains come. The ships fill. The convoy lists read like liturgy. And somewhere far from all of it, a unit opens crates and finds exactly what their list had promised and feels the rare, war-born gratitude of being expected and provided for. Institutions can also fail, and it is a mark of health when they can be corrected without breaking their bones. A committee that has grown timid can be replaced by one that has been given deadlines with teeth. A specification that preserved an old pride can be revised by engineers who value the field's suffering over the office's dignity. A manager whose charm has shielded a process that wastes hours can be promoted out of the way with a smile. These surgical interventions keep the organism young without asking it to become someone else. And when they work, the plant's pace tightens almost imperceptibly, like a belt pulled one notch closer to the body. Observers who came from systems that were more brittle or more poetic sometimes mistook this impersonality for a lack of soul. They did not see the kind of love that bureaucracy can hold, a love of things behaving, of promises kept, of calendars respected, of strangers prepared for because they are not strangers once the document has named them. The line's speed was the visible effect of that love. It is a hard sentence to accept if your life taught you that meaning lives only in the stroke of a master's hand. But meaning can also live in a part that fits, in a shipment that arrives, in a shift that ends with the count met and no one hurt, in a prisoner's admission that what he saw made him revise the way the world adds up. What these institutions finally gave the factory was confidence. Not bravado, which is what rumor mistakes for strength, but a quiet conviction that the plan could survive contact with weather and human nature. The supervisor could start a day believing that the day would end within the lines. The worker could perform a task knowing that the next hands would find the work recognizable. The inspector could sign on the line and go home with the clean fatigue that honest work offers. The dispatcher could push a train and sleep, and on the other side of an ocean, a unit could write the date of its replenishment in a notebook and be right more often than not. That is the kind of speed that resists erosion by story. It does not care if it is praised. It cares if it is on time. In such a world, the extraordinary becomes ordinary on purpose. That is the point. The first tank that came off the line with all its bolts talked to a sequence not invented at the station felt like an event. The 1,000th was a day at work. The 10,000th was a proof that institutions, when they choose humility over drama, can bend time into a shape that serves the future. The men who saw trains and thought, with a mixture of dread and respect, that they were watching a law of nature, were not wrong. They were watching human agreements made so reliable that they took on the shape of gravity, and gravity, as everyone knows, speeds things up when they begin to fall the right way. There is a superstition that a factory's fence is the end of the story, as if the whistle that dismisses the shift also dismisses our obligation to explain what happens next. But the speed that startled so many witnesses was not a number that lived under a roof. It was a chain reaction, and the next link after acceptance stamps was a set of rails leading away from a yard that behaved like an organ. The first rule of throughput is that the flat car sets the tempo for everything beyond the test track. If the car is late, if the yard is sulking, if dispatchers have not been given the authority to clear a passage, a week's worth of good work becomes a sculpture garden. When the cars arrive on time and leave on time, speed ceases to be a boast and becomes a schedule. Yard crews work to turn idle weight into motion. Chalk marks that told a crane operator where to place a hull, tension in chains that taught a train how to behave at speed, paperwork that moved faster than rumor, so a set of vehicles was not trapped by a missing code. There is nothing glamorous in this, which is why it is worth saying slowly. The art is in refusing to let the miracle be wasted. The railroads had their own discipline, old and stern, and allergic to improvisation. They adopted wartime priorities with a severity that felt like courtesy. The right trains moved first because moving the wrong trains first would have been a kind of lie. Sidings were cleared like lungs exhaling. The timetable was altered to favor weight that mattered. The effect of this discipline on a faraway battlefield is easy to miss if you love diagrams. What it meant in a town you have never heard of is that a string of identical silhouettes did not pause where gossip could touch it. What it meant at a port was that cranes solved weight problems before dawn, and stevedores obeyed a plan that had been thought through by people who feared dithering more than storms. The convoy list, which to a clerk is just a page, to a soldier is a promise. When the list is kept, disbelief begins to crack. The convoy itself is a rhythm that respects danger but does not flatter it. Loading is a choreography of tonnage and trim. The cargo masters, those shy governors of the sea's opinion, balance vehicles, fuel, spares, rations, and the quiet gravity of men's lives so that a ship will behave when waves want to argue. The ships leave not because fate likes them, but because an escort is ready and fuel has been counted and 1,000 small permissions were sought and granted exactly when they were needed. The ocean does not love order, but it yields to it. When the convoy arrives, the tempo repeats in reverse. Cranes decide. Yard gangs sprint without running. The right piles grow where they belong. A truck's first destination is never a guess. Beyond the port, another species of speed begins. Depots matter more than statues. They receive, sort, test again, and teach reliability to behave under a different sky. The kit that accompanies a vehicle settles the question of whether a machine is merely present or immediately useful. A good kit is the opposite of romance. It is a list written by someone who can imagine what will fail and refuses to condescend to the mechanic sent to fix it. When spare engines arrive as if they are cousins and not strangers, a field workshop stops being a desperate enterprise and becomes a real institution. Men work better when the parts speak the same dialect. The depot's ledger is a choir book. If you can read it, you can hear the war breathe. Training is another current in the same river. A fresh battalion does not meet its equipment as a surprise party. Crews are rotated into machines that will be theirs, taught the noises they should ignore and the ones that mean stop and look. The first week always decides more than the official history admits. Vehicles must be shaken, restraints loosened, talks checked again because transit teaches bolts to reconsider their loyalties. Manuals that were written in ink are rewritten in grease pencil on the back of a toolbox. The miracle of speed, if there is one, is that this bedding-in period happens under a roof and not under fire, because schedules were kept upstream. The practical is the generous. The road to the front is not a line, it is a braid. Columns move with escort and discretion, and depot officers become traffic cops with theology. A unit that needs 10 hulls receives 10 hulls rather than 8 and 2 promises. The supply sergeant reads his list and finds his expectations echoed by the crates he opens. The field then performs its own acceptance test in trials that do not have an audience. Engines that sulked at the port clear their throats and find their manners. Tracks settle into their first miles of penance. The parts clerk who was trained to count in peace counts in mud, and nothing about his arithmetic changes. When observers describe this as impossible, they are responding to the feeling that the factory has extended its fence around them and turned chaos into an annex of order. They are not wrong to feel fenced. The true perimeter of production was never the brick wall with a gatehouse. It was the last mile of a country road in the rain where a truck stops and a driver hands a clipboard to a corporal who cannot believe that the right things are on it. At that moment, the factory is present, not as a building, but as a habit of keeping promises. That habit is what speed looks like when it walks. The danger in speaking clearly about tempo is that clarity can start to sound like pride. Pride is a poor tailor. It will dress anything it can catch in armor that does not fit. So this is an accounting of the places where the promise of cadence met the facts, of steel and weather, and came away scuffed. The first truth is that production is never a magic spell that banishes trade-offs. Design choices made in good faith at a drawing board can leave their fingerprints on the field in ways that cannot be scrubbed by line rate. Armor thickness, gun selection, weight distribution, engine philosophy. Each is a vote in a long election. Some votes age well, some do not. A vehicle that was taught to be reliable does not automatically become invulnerable. There were fights where the machine's virtues were asked to carry more than their share, and men paid the difference. Quality escapes happened too. A surge month will always invite a defect to slip through wearing a borrowed name. An inspector who has earned his boredom learns that boredom is a predator and treats it as one. Even so, seals wept where drawings promised dry, gears fretted when their teeth should have kissed cleanly, Electrical harnesses rubbed themselves into trouble because a clamp was installed with more optimism than wisdom. In a system that respects itself, these were not rumors, they were reports. The line's health showed in the speed and seriousness with which the reports were turned into drawings with new rev marks. A fix that arrives late is still a fix. The field notices the difference between a mistake that is denied and a mistake that is forgiven by the next shipment of parts. Transport staged its own rebellions. Storms will ignore logic. A yard that was a model last week can develop a temper this week for reasons that have nothing to do with diligence. A port clogs because everyone is right at the same time, and the rules have not anticipated what happens when logic breeds gridlock. Men who believed in schedules were forced to learn patience, then forced to forget it when the schedule returned, because impatience is the virtue of a system that wants to keep its promises. The best dispatchers carry two clocks, the one on the wall and the one in their head that knows what will be true 3 days from now. When their second clock failed them, speed shrank to human scale and had to grow again the next shift. There were months when training lagged demand. A machine that behaves the same way every time flatters the assumption that any pair of hands will do. It is an illusion. Hands need to be taught what sameness permits and what it forbids. A rushed conversion of crews created a fog of small mistakes that slowed the field's work into humility. The cure was patient and unromantic. More hours on a range no one remembers. More checklists read with lips moving. More acceptance of the fact that repetition is not an insult to intelligence but a gift to survival. In those months, it might have been tempting to retreat to craft myths to believe that slower, rarer, more mystically made machines would save time in the end. The numbers refused to be charmed. Design improvements sometimes lagged the gossip about them. A new gun, a better transmission, a correction in stowage that would save fingers under stress, these were announced in mess hall prophecy long before crates arrived. Delay can turn faith sour. It is a hazard of any large organism that speaks with many mouths. The adult reply was to shut a few of those mouths and give the ones that remained a calendar, then meet the calendar. When the change came, it came at scale and invited the field to forget that it had been wronged by rumor. Memory obliged because the work ahead demanded it. And yet, after each stumble, the tempo reasserted itself with a temperate kind of pride. The proof is not that critics fell silent. Critics never do. The proof is in the accumulation of small, honest gains, a failure mode that appears less frequently on a maintenance sheet, a depot that sees more engines come and go like guests instead of patients, a train that arrives neither early nor late but on time enough to be useful. Men in the field will always tell darker stories than the plate for lead. Ledger, because they live where the ledger's claims are practiced in bad weather. Their stories should be respected. Their corrections should be read aloud in the plant. Then the plant must keep its metronome. The worst error would have been to let missteps provoke theatrics. The line's dignity is not in its errors but in its refusal to let errors write policy. The lesson, then, is not that speed escaped judgment. It is that speed submitted to judgment and kept returning. The system that faltered did not apologize with poetry. It apologized with changes that could be measured and with crates that contained the parts people had actually asked for. The calendar that had been sketched in optimism was rewritten in ink after it proved itself. In this way, the war taught factories an adult truth, that peacetime sometimes lets them forget. Grace is not the absence of failure. It is the presence of repair that arrives quickly enough to matter. If you want to know what disbelief looks like when it forgets to defend itself, listen to a man who has been fed and warmed and is trying to turn shock into sentences. He will reach for comparisons his hands remember. He will describe the machine that carried him through training, the smell of his unit's workshop on winter mornings, the way an old foreman taught him that every piece deserves a stare before it deserves a signature. He will describe the first time he saw an enemy's rail yard disgorge what looked like a copy of a copy of a copy, and how his head refused to believe that people could do this without cheating. He will talk about the sameness as if sameness were a sin, then correct himself and call it something closer to fate. With time behind wire, his recollections settle into shapes. He admits that the vehicles he had dismissed as rushed did not behave like rushed things when he walked around them under a white flag. Hinges met doors with a friendliness that felt planned. Hatches closed and felt like they had closed 1,000 times before. Armor plate betrayed no hurry where plates meet plates. He remembers that the replacement column that passed him trudging along a road looked as if it had rehearsed being a column. He does not have the language of process. He has the language of awe and grudging respect. He uses it poorly at first, then well enough that an interviewer can see the outline of the truth through his imperfect words. When peace comes and libraries swell, his testimony is visited by historians who have learned to love footnotes as if they were blood. They triangulate his images with schedules and plant ledgers and supply rosters that never cared who won the argument in a barracks. They find that beneath the exaggerations he was faithful to the shape of events. He was wrong about numbers and right about tempo. He was wrong about miracle and right about structure. The strangeness he reported was not a trick invented to break his courage. It was a system that made speed into a local climate where he fought. That system did not have to hate him to defeat him. It only had to keep its promises. His later years are full of small betrayals of his early contempt. He will praise the impersonal elegance of a bracket he once mocked. He will admit, if asked by a gentle questioner, that there was a relief in facing an enemy who believed in schedules, because schedules are at least arguments you can join. He will hold a piece from a museum and turn it in his hands, and note that the edges were finished, the way his old shop would have finished them. He will separate the field's cruelties from the factory's achievements, and say, with a maturity that sorrow sometimes teaches, that the process which supplied his enemy also supplied an end to scarcity for the men he once loved. It is not forgiveness. It is a larger box drawn around a smaller box. Meanwhile, the documents keep their quiet counsel. They show how what he saw was made. They show that the trains he counted badly were not an illusion. They show, more importantly, that even if he had counted well, the numbers would not have carried the meaning by themselves. Meaning required the visible repetition of standards across geography, the predictable discipline of institutions that kept human weakness from becoming institutional habit, and the humility of tools that do not pretend to be more than they are. If he misses these abstractions, that is because abstractions are poor meals. He saw meals. The people who study him later need the abstractions so they do not starve on too much detail. The dignity of his witness is that it remains useful even after the scholars have finished their work. It supplies the shock that data cannot give. It reminds the listener that the tempo of a factory becomes a smell and a sound and a feeling in the chest of a person a continent away. It also reminds the engineer, who can drown in digests and tolerances, that the human meaning of a good schedule is a unit that believes it will not be left alone. Stories travel longer than ledgers, and sometimes they deserve to. When his story ends, it leaves behind the simplest admission a professional can make. I did my work well, but I met a system that did its work together, and together was faster than I knew how to be. The phrase has a way of recruiting the imagination. It asks for drama. It wants fireworks and a secret you can learn in an afternoon. But after a long walk through mills and yards and offices and rooms where men argued over a clamp's placement as if they were deciding how to live, you know better than to be seduced by a phrase. You carry a smaller set of questions instead, practical enough to fit in a pocket and stubborn enough to ignore applause. The first question is about dates. When did the line rate climb, and was it a single leap or a staircase? If someone presents a single shining month as proof of a miracle, you ask what the months before it and after it looked like. Speed that cannot hold. A season is a rumor, not a discipline. The second question is about hours. How many hours of direct work lived inside each hull, and did a drop in hours correspond to an improvement upstream, or to an inspection regime that looked away? A number can be honest and misleading at the same time. It is not an accusation to ask which kind of honesty you are being offered. The third question is about sameness. Are sub-assemblies truly compatible across plants, and do depots report confidence when marrying cousins? Sameness is not a faith, it is a statistic. If maintenance logs tell different stories under identical roofs, the statistics are lying and need to be corrected until they behave. Then there is transport, the quiet decider. What did the rail yard do with the work it was given? How long did a finished hull wait before it learned its train's name? Did ports eat cargo and digest it into convoys that left on time, or did cargo pile up like a bad conscience? The test of speed is not the photograph of a line in motion. It is the absence of photographs of a siding pretending to be a warehouse. Finally, there is the field, where every boast kneels. What do units say about their first week with a new batch? How many crates arrived with exactly the parts that fail in that design under that weather? Are crews learning the same lessons across the map, or is each unit forced to invent local truths because the shipment would not admit the general one written on the drawing? If these questions seem small, it is because they are the size of the truth. They scale. They travel across time better than slogans. They would have made sense to the inspector who stamped acceptance at a plant gate, to the dispatcher who turned a train before coffee went cold, to the depot officer who opened a crate and saw his own discipline reflected back at him, and to the prisoner who finally learned that what he had called magic was a calendar people kept. And if you want a conclusion that a person can use, it is as modest as it is durable. When you hear unbelievable speed, teach the phrase manners by asking it to sit down next to a timetable, a work-hour ledger, a transport log, and a maintenance sheet. If it refuses the company, it is not worth the seat. There is a final kindness to be paid to those who mistook system for sorcery. They were telling you something about how hard it is to imagine strangers agreeing. To build at speed, you must persuade thousands to treat the same nouns with the same respect every day. That persuasion is an achievement most histories are too busy to honor. But honoring it is how you keep from forgetting what made the trains look like fate. The story you have just read is not, at its core, about machines. It is about agreements held under pressure. It is about calendar pages turned by hands that could have been doing something else. It is about boredom made sacred, because boredom, in the right place, saves lives. So carry forward the habit, not the headline. Define the terms before the drumbeat. Name the dates early, and return to them without apology. Keep a fast facts card that you do not let anyone decorate with adjectives. Invite skepticism and teach it where to look. Admit the trade-offs and repair the errors as if repair were a sacrament. And when someone far away says that men facing those trains could not fathom what they were seeing, accept that disbelief not as an indictment of their understanding, but as an endorsement of a country's decision to turn competence into a climate. The climate did the rest.